Jim Aslan, welcome to Weird Sauce. Thank you for making time for us from your location in the United States. And it's a great pleasure to have you on. Can you kindly introduce yourself for our audience?
Um, I am what's called a lab leaker. I am someone that's spent an inordinate amount of time online debating the origins of SARS-CoV-2. So my story is I'm a viscosity specialist. I'm not a virologist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. And a lot of people just roll their eyes and tune me out the second they hear that, as would I. And I'm here to tell you every virologist in this debate knows who I am. I have emerged from the scrum, and it was a scrum for the past 5+ years. We were arguing, debating, fighting, calling each other names, and all that other stuff, mainly on Twitter. And from that scrum, I've emerged with a pretty crazy, I would say radical, counterintuitive answer to what happened in Wuhan in late 2019. So I have to tell you what I am. I'm a viscosity specialist. I'm selling viscometers to labs, not to virologists, just like motor oil, drilling fluids, toothpaste, anything that uses viscosity is basically what the equipment's used for. When you always think about viscosity, you're thinking about the ultimate viscosity, the movement of particles in air is the ultimate example of that. So I was, what I call myself basically is also an aerosol specialist. So I was more interested in the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. While everyone else on the biology side was interested in the genome, I was interested in the transmission. And when you get involved in the transmission side of things, I don't go too far into the weeds too quick, you can quickly piece together and reverse engineer, and that's the name of my Substack, who did this, because you can see which lab animals were used to aerosolize the agent. So it's a completely different way of looking at this. And I came to the debate relatively late. I came in about 2021, about the time this guy, this American, who I've written in my book as The American Hero, Chapter 7, named Major Joseph Murphy. And he reached into a top secret folder inside the Pentagon, inside Washington, D.C., and he pulled out this document written in 2018 by a white man in a white lab coat. And his name is Ralph Barrick. And he literally says in this document written in 2018, I, Ralph Barrick, will create SARS-CoV-2, and I, Ralph Barrick, will provide it to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for testing on their Chinese horseshoe bats. So this is what we have, a pre-confession to the crime of creating COVID-19, and it's written in 2018. I'm going to quit my rant here pretty quick. But Jeffrey Sachs, it's someone we all know. I need to pull a name out of the hat that people can recognize, has pulled me out of obscurity. And he put me in front of the World Health Organization recently. And he said, debate him. And I feel I won. And that was last year. And that debate spilled into Nature. Nature is the premier publication of science. And in there, they're trying to bash my theory, which is not a theory in my opinion, it's turning into a fact. This thing, COVID-19, I'm here to tell you with 100% certainty, was a bat vaccine. This thing that we thought was a virus was a transmissible bat vaccine. So I'm stop there because I probably already throw at everyone, for a crazy loop. But there's a lot more involved in it. There's a lot more evidence involved in that. But everyone I'll summarize by this. I'm a proud no one. I do not have a dog in the fight. That's apparently my asset in this thing. If you are a scientist, you basically have, some sort of conflict of interest. There's really no way around it because everyone goes to the U.S. government for funding. And I'm here to tell you, the U.S. government funded a contagious bat vaccine, developed it on U.S. soil, and it shipped it off to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for testing, where it got out accidentally. So this was an accident. It was an animal vaccine. That's why I can talk about this relatively calmly and coolly on camera, in person, with my name, without going some alias, without hiding underneath a rock, because it was an accident. I just want us to have an adult discussion about what that accident was. So that's who I am in a nutshell.
Okay. So let me just zoom a little bit out for people who are not inside of this as much as you are. Just to remind a lot of people, because the audience might be also francophone and listening to this, translating, and they don't necessarily know as much about the whole subject of gain of function and how big that sort of quote unquote industry really is and was before the SARS-CoV-2. So maybe you if you could speak a little bit about that and how this, the diffuse proposal, because that's part of the issue of how it came about in the lab of Ralph Barrick. It's not just any name of any scientist in any functional lab. It's a very specific lab that it belongs to. And I think seeing it through perhaps the histogram of gain of function might be a good way for people to familiarize themselves with the subject.
So the gain of function, I guess, debate emerged around 2012. There was some ferrets that were used by a Ron Fouchier in the Netherlands. And he basically turned a non-airborne agent into an airborne agent using ferrets. He forces the virus. This was H1N1, I believe, a flu virus that was not airborne. He forced it into the nose of a ferret. He caused a sneeze. It got airborne, and it goes to the next ferret. And then it went to the next ferret. And then it went to the next ferret. He made this thing transmissible in air. He basically turned a nothing into a something. And the New York Times called it an engineered doomsday. And he said, "Yeah, it's exactly what I was trying to do. I did what I did. I was really proud of it." And I don't want to get too far off base, but the guy working for him, Ron Fouchier, who most people know if you're into the gain of function debate, was Vincent Munster. He is also involved in the creation of COVID-19. So the guy that was literally in the lab in Erasmus in the Netherlands is one of the two, is Ralph Barrick's colleague, is Ralph Barrick's buddy. He's the one that aerosolized the agent. So I'll stay away from that right now. So you go to 2012, and it comes all the way to 2015, and there's another paper written by Ralph Barrick, and he's written this thing with Xizing Li, and he has basically taken one of her bat samples. Xizing Li is the bat lady in Wuhan. If you're into the lab leak debate, she's basically the woman you see this giant BSL-4 spacesuit, little Asian woman. Everyone that's met her describes her the same. She's very petite, and she's basically so small she can crawl into the bat caves in remote China, go into the bats and collect them, put a Q-tip up their butt, collect a bat sample, go back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, put it into a PCR machine, an aluminum machine, they call it, and she could upload the sample. Sometimes it's called SHCO14 in the case of the 2015 paper. Other times it's called RATG13, which a lot of people have heard of in the lab leak debate. And she uploads these samples to the US database where someone like Ralph Barrick can download the samples, and he can create what's called countermeasures. Ralph Barrick, the white man of the white lab coat in North Carolina, in America, does not even need to travel to China to get his samples. He can just pay the bat lady in Wuhan to collect these samples for him. Whenever you saw all that money and all that talk about gain of function from the US to Wuhan, that was essentially money from Tony Fauci, from Ralph Barrick to the bat lady, Xizing Li, to go out there and collect bat samples. She is to collect these samples for Ralph Barrick, and she is to upload them to the NIH database called NCBI for Ralph Barrick, where he can download them and he can recreate a live Chinese virus in his North Carolina lab. His technology is so good. No one else can do this, by the way, as best I can tell, for a coronavirus, which is 30,000 nucleotides, one of the largest viruses known to man. And he can create a live virus, a contagious live virus from a genome sequence that has been downloaded and collected by Xizing Li in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So anything that Xizing Li had in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Ralph Barrick had. So in 2015, he wrote a paper with her. And again, here we go with the engineered doomsday. But essentially, when you dive into the details of that paper, Ralph Barrick was trying to create a live attenuated vaccine using her bat samples. So this is what's happening right now. By 2015, we have bat samples from Wuhan going to North Carolina in Ralph Barrick's possession. And there's a few more papers. He kind of goes quiet with her, to be honest with you, because we don't see any papers between Xizing Li and Ralph Barrick from about 2016 to 2020. But again, there's this DARPA diffuse document buried in the top secret folder of the Pentagon. And in there, Ralph Barrick now says something for the first time. I will provide back this engineered genome back to the bat lady. I will do some gain of function on this inert sample she's done. In this case, I will take her RATG13 sample. I will put a furin cleavage site in it. This is essentially the smoking gun, some people call it, for genomic engineering and SARS-CoV-2. In the middle of this 30,000 nucleotide sequence is this furin cleavage site, furin. Just think about, a woman's breast, furin. Right in the middle of this thing is this beautiful biological anomaly. And it's never been seen in these sarbecoviruses, SARS-like viruses before. Not one sample out of the thousands that the US government, USAID, PREDICT, and all these other weird agencies have collected over the years, has there been a sample that has a furin cleavage site in a sarbecovirus. This one does. So this was what makes it look like it was engineered. And someone has taken RATG13 from Xizing Li, Ralph Barrick. He has modified the genome, put a furin cleavage site in, and provided it back to the bat lady in Wuhan. He has done gain of function in North Carolina. So these samples are shared back and forth. When you dive into the FOIAs and the Freedom of Information request, you see these what are called material transfer agreements. They basically have an agreement to share samples with one another. So if a virus is engineered, wherever it spilled over into the human population does not tell us where it was engineered. So that's what kind of opened up this whole thing. And this gain of function is not just gain of function on genomes, it's the shipment of viruses between labs. And there's a lot of it going on. The technology is so great. They can basically, Ralph Barrick's technology fits in a 1 millimeter tube, and it sits on dry ice, and it flies on the plane underneath your feet in the cargo hold.
And can I ask, do you have a theory as to why that gain of function was done? So is it now assumed to be a military output that they were looking at? Is it assumed to be truly a healthcare, even flawly design attempt? What is your at that stage? What is your best theory about what was the point? To what end were they doing this exchange?
It's all the above. That's my answer to that. It's truly all the above. In 2017, the U.S. military, the Pentagon, DARPA, it's called, approached Peter Daszak. Peter Daszak is someone that we know in the Lab Leak debate. He was kind of the liaison between Xi Jinping, the Bat Lady, and Tony Fauci and Ralph Barrick. He's this British man with a British passport living in New York City who started this EcoHealth Alliance, and he's doing it for money. There's no doubt, because there's a lot of money in biodefense. It's called, Fauci calls it dual use research of concern. That is my favorite term. A lot of people get mad at me when I come out and tell people SARS-CoV-2 is a vaccine, an animal vaccine. They go, no, it's a bioweapon. Well, it doesn't matter. It's dual use. We basically learn how this technology reaches such a peak that it doesn't matter if it's the weapon or the vaccine. It's still doing the same thing. It's just disrupting society beyond, no end. So it's all the above. But the recent term I've heard is that it's called countermeasures. They are creating countermeasures. That's a military term. And countermeasures are a cash king. There's a lot of money in this. In other words, the ability to create a vaccine or a treatment or an antibody to a potential lethal pathogen. And all these lethal pathogens come from bats. This is the story that emerged in about late 2015, 16, 17, 18. And essentially, SARS-1 came from bats. If your listeners are old enough to remember, it was a Hong Kong market, a Hong
Yeah,
Kong area market in
we suffered from
2003.
it. Yeah, we suffered from it in
Okay. It
Singapore
did
as
not
well.
reach America. It got to as close as Canada, but it burned out. That was, it was killer, but it wasn't contagious. Ebola came from bats. Marburg came from bats. Rabies is the ultimate example. It comes from bats. So there are Chinese scientists that just created just published a bat vaccine paper for rabies. So all these scientists, even as we speak here in 2026, are still doing this crazy research. The countermeasure is not to vaccinate humans. This countermeasure was to vaccinate the bats. They wanted to vaccinate the bats against SARS-like viruses, against Ebola-like viruses, against Marburg-like viruses, against rabies. So rabies comes from bats. People don't think about that. But here in America, and I think it also happens in Europe, they drop baits from planes to try and vaccinate the intermediary species. It's raccoons here in America, but the raccoons catch the rabies from bats, and they want to vaccinate the raccoons before it infects Fido, the family dog. But the idea is instead of vaccinating the raccoon or the intermediary species, whether it's the civet cat or we've all heard about these other, I can't remember some of the ones. The raccoon dog is the one we heard about in the Wuhan wet market. All these other crazy, and intermediary species, it's pointless to vaccinate them because there's too many. Just go to the source and vaccinate the bats. So that was the latest terrible idea that these virologists had, and they're still doing it. They're still talking about it.
But it beggars belief to think that a military or military adjacent program like the likes of what Barrick was doing, etc., would then go to a somewhat adversary in the world, if not one of the biggest adversary, China military, with the whole history of China, doing intelligence operation, etc., going to a military run. That's my understanding. Wuhan Institute of Virology is near military run, if not entirely military run, and start doing this kind of overt collaboration. I mean, I maybe I'm naive, but I just don't get it. Like nobody was in that room that said, "Wait, what? You're going to do what with whom?" No, I don't think it's a great idea. Or is there no central command to the point where Fauci can stay there and say, "So what? Yeah, we were collaborating not with Iceland or some small country in Norway, whatever that we have fairly big trust with, but with China." I mean, it beggars belief. So what's your logic behind that?
So in August of 2021, when I first really entered into the details of the lab leak debate, I came late. I've been called a second generation lab leaker. I showed up when everyone else had done the hard work. No one had found a PLA member, a PLA scientist, a CCP scientist in the Wuhan Institute of Virology before 2020. No one. Not the members of Drastic, not the U.S. military. I mean, you've seen a few things, but it's pretty obvious who wrote them from like the U.S. State Department. No one has named one. No one has identified one. No one has a picture of a member of the PLA in Wuhan before 2020 because there is none. There were none. It's not a military town. It is an academic town. It's I think it's been called the Paris almost of China in a way. It's very modern. It does have wet markets, but they're not super dirty as you see in the news. They have Prada shoes, they have Starbucks coffee, they have Honda manufacturing. It is a first world city in a developing country. So there is no member of the PLA in Wuhan before 2020. The PLA did take over the lab after Lab Leak. They showed up in 2020 or January 2020. And there's a named general, and she's a woman. She took over that thing. She's like, what the heck's going on over there in Wuhan? It's an academic town. It's a bunch of dorks, not spooks. There is not one. So in my theory, in August of 2021, to come back to that, was a PLA guy in I don't even know the name of the town, but it's near the North Korean border because there are none in Wuhan. So I had to leave Wuhan to go find myself a suspect that could aerosolize the agent, and I found some guy in the North Korean border. So I was along with you. I was right there with you. There's some dirty Chinese military behind this thing. It is military grade technology that floats 60 feet in air, 20 meters, and it infects us in less than 15 minutes. This thing was, it may not be a bioweapon in the sense that it kills you, but it sure is a bioweapon in the sense that it spreads. And that's what I really got interested in. There's a book over my shoulder called Fluid Mechanics. And essentially, in that book, I could study the movement of air. And when I studied the movement of air, I quickly realized this thing was not developed by a Chinese scientist. The first clue was the spillback into mink. If you remember those mink farms in Denmark and those mink farms in the Netherlands, near Erasmus, by the way, because that's when I first started clue on maybe that Ron Fouchier has something to do with this. I mean, about 15 minutes from where Erasmus University is in southern Netherlands is a mink farm that had a spillover event. Once SARS-CoV-2 spilled into mink, I was like, well, that's funny because those aren't European mink, those aren't Chinese mink, those are American mink. They are American mink used to grow fur. So that black fur coat you had came from an American mink farm, probably in Europe. But that was a clue. There ain't no American mink in China, and that's where my brain started to get a little sideways. And I moved away from the PLA guy near the North Korean border, and I started to move towards Ron Fouchier. Then another spillback occurred, and it was the American deer. And I'm like, what the hell is COVID from Wuhan doing in American deer? Well, guess what? American scientists use American deer for to model, develop, and create self-spreading vaccines. So I've now eliminated Europe because COVID doesn't infect European deer. COVID doesn't infect or transmit in Chinese deer. But red and roe, by the way, and Sika deer are those three. But it only infects American deer. And once it started to transmit in American deer, transmit means onward transmission. I know COVID infects everything. It infects your cat. It infects your dog. It infects, pretty much a frog, a fish. It affects even the raccoon dog and a humanized mouse. But it doesn't transmit onwards from a humanized mouse. It doesn't transmit onwards from a raccoon dog. It doesn't transmit onward from a dog or a cat. But it does transmit onward from American mink. It does transmit onward from American deer. There was another little animal called the American deer mouse that transmits onward. That's this North American rat. You see, I keep using the word American here. There's another animal that transmits it onward. It's called the American bat, the American lab bat, called the Egyptian fruit bat. And then there's a fifth animal, the Syrian hamster. That's that little furry pet you had as a kid. Those are all five of those mammals are only found in one place in time, and that's in Rocky Mountain Lab, and that is Tony Fauci's biodefense lab in Montana. So there's your military angle. Tony Fauci has built a Fort Detrick lab in Montana. It was his baby, his post 9/11 biodefense fort that he built after the 9/11 Twin Tower attack here in America. He got a ton of money. He became the biodefense general. I call him the 5-star bio general in my book. And he turned Rocky Mountain Lab, this little town with this giant biodefense lab with a BSL-4 inside of it that has inside of it the guy named Vincent Munster. He is the protege of Ron Fouchier from the Netherlands, and he is the one that aerosolized Barrick's agent using those 5 mammals that I just mentioned. Now, I have asked, I'm in my rant here, I've asked Ralph Barrick, I've asked Vincent Munster, and Tony Fauci knows who I am. I've asked all 3 of them recently, you have to provide me an alibi or I'm going to keep talking about you on camera. And they won't do it because they can't defend themselves because they did it. They aerosolized the agent in Rocky Mountain Lab. Tony Fauci's biodefense lab got in bed with this Ralph Barrick character I've already talked about and helped him create this bat vaccine, this transmissible bat vaccine. And I'll stop here. I got to stop pretty quick. You just take it. You take one needle out. So one needle is injected into one animal, and it basically infects the animal like a vaccine would. It inoculates it, but it doesn't stop there. It uses what Dr. Razik said. He's my backup. In case you need someone else to talk about this, it's Dr. Razik from Meragenomics. He uses the term, it now becomes infectious through air. I love that term he used. It is now infectious through air. It transmits the vaccine. Not it looks like a virus, but it transmits as a vaccine to the next animal. Because when you're trying to inoculate animals, like bats in particular, there's so many of them, and you just can't reach them. And look how hard it was for Xi Zhengli, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to travel all the way to like 1,000 miles to go collect these bat samples and travel all the way back. It was just impossible to go out there and vaccinate these animals. So if you want to vaccinate against SARS, you need the vaccine to be contagious. So the idea, and it came actually from Europe. It came from Spain. It was done like 20 years ago. It's kind of an old idea that came back. Some guy went out there to the Mediterranean and vaccinated a bunch of rabbits. From a Spanish university, so this idea started in Europe and it came to America, and 20 years later, and here we are talking about it. But then it spreads through air infectiously. Doesn't that sound like COVID? The way it just kind of spreads autonomously, but it doesn't want to kill you. It just wants to kind of, I call your infection an inoculation. Essentially, that's what happened. We were the bats. We got turned into the lab bats, Tony Fauci's lab bats. That's what we were for the past 5+ years. Tony Fauci's grand experiment. He turned the entire world into his lab with this thing. And yeah, it's unfortunate. But the problem was none of us knew what it was. The virus was a vaccine, an animal vaccine. It's nasty. Don't get me wrong. It looks like a bioweapon because the same kind of people that can make this thing can also work for the wrong side. But just to end it where you started, no PLA, no military in Wuhan, academic town. There is a woman, a white woman, who was in the BSL-4. Her name is Danielle Anderson. And bless her heart, not her fault, she was patient zero. How do I know? I got her boss, Lim Wong, to admit to me he stepped down on January 10th of 2020. That's the born on date for SARS-CoV-2. So he recognized the sequence. He did the honorable thing. He resigned as Duke's emerging infectious disease director in Singapore. And yeah, he's still there as a professor, but he's no longer the director. And Danielle Anderson mysteriously left in November 2019, along with Lympha. We have their cell phones basically crawling around that BSL-4 at a very odd time, doing some very weird recon work, essentially, from a lockdown BSL-4 perspective. But yeah, it got on her watch. And what did she have? Peter Daszak admitted it: access to the Chinese horseshoe bats. These little precious, tiny little animals that are no bigger than your fist were the source of SARS-1, and they were the target for this SARS-2 bat vaccine. So she had access to. That's the only thing Wuhan had, and it's the only reason why Wuhan's a story. And Ralph Berg's writing about it. I don't have the bats here in North Carolina. I have to provide this genome of mine, this modified genome, to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for testing on their bats. And he would provide it to Lympha Wong and Danielle Anderson for doing that. So Xi Zhengli is not even really part of the story, to be honest with you. The bat lady is, in my opinion, I don't want to get into it here because it's a bit difficult. She's the whistleblower. She published a piece of evidence that made SARS-2 look engineered, and yeah, but it was obviously engineered by someone else.
So, if I'm following along, so you mentioned yet another location, which is Duke NUS, which is in Singapore. So, if I follow along, then Ralph Baric and Fauci with the budget, Ralph Baric with the capability, missing the animals that he needs, uses the Yuan Institute of Virology for their sampling capacity and their transferability of the prototype, if you like, onto bats. What is the role in there of Duke NUS in Singapore in that triangle?
That's a good way of putting in a triangle. And what is his role? It's very important. Lympha Wong, I used to pronounce it Wang, it's Wong, is the keystone. He is what's called a bat immunologist. He has made a name for himself studying bats. Bats are not birds, they are mammals like you and me. And that was what he hung his hat on. We can use these bats as our modern day lab monkey. Monkeys are expensive. There are no lab monkeys. There may be a few in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but there aren't many. They're very expensive to keep. They're not. I mean, just look at them. I mean, they're little small humans. They kick, they scream, they bite. But these bats are little tiny humans. They have he was at one point Lympha Wong when he started this bat lab. He has what's called a live bat colony in Singapore, where he basically has gone out there and kidnapped the bat, brought them back into Singapore in his lab at Duke NUS, which is basically Duke University in Singapore. And he has started to breed these bats. They basically put them in a cage together. They breed, they have offspring and all that. And these bats are born into captivity. And it's seen as the holy grail for bat research. And when you do bat research, you're also doing human research. And he was making a lot of money doing this. When you were able to replicate a virus inside this host, you can do a lot of research. When you're able to test your vaccine in the reservoir host like a bat. You can make a lot of money testing your vaccines, testing your countermeasures, testing your whatever you want to do with it. He was even talking about bringing in cardiologists to basically study bats because they have a similar heart rhythm. But on top of the fact, he's really curious about why the bats can harbor these viruses and not get sick. That is, if you inject Ebola into us, we die within this conversation. If you inject Ebola into the bat, it just winks at you. So that's what he's really curious about, why these bats are these reservoir hosts. So he is what's called a bat immunologist. He has studied a bat's immune system, and he can translate that into a human's immune system because there's a lot going on. There's a lot of similarity there too. So what he has done is made a name for himself testing these viruses, testing these countermeasures, testing everything on them. So he's a very important person in this grand scheme of things. He has moved the whole virology community into studying live bats, and everyone's kind of come along with him. So once you study Lim-Fa Wang, you kind of study the creation of SARS-CoV-2 because he's so involved in it. I'm going to say he's the driver behind the idea. That was obviously Ralph Baric, but Ralph Baric is spending more time reading Lim-Fa Wang than Lim-Fa Wang is reading Ralph Baric. I think that's a good way of putting it.
And in terms of then accountability IP equivalent, so Duke NUS is an American institution, but is sitting in Singapore in the with an alliance with the National University of Singapore. So in that triangulation, were they equivalent to Wuhan, or were they considered more important, less important, more strategic, less strategic than the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
um, More important. So Lim-Fa Wang was the one that trained Xi Jinping. Lim-Fa Wang's proteges. I think it's Peng Zhu, if I have it right. It works at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He has basically brought the Wuhan Institute of Virology into the bat research. So if there is no Lim-Fa Wang, there is no SARS-CoV-2, and there's no Wuhan story. Probably that's how important he is. I can't emphasize that enough. It's hard for people to even comprehend who he is because he's off the radar. He's not even in the news. But he's so important. He steps down on January 10th of 2020, and that's not a random date in history. He's known as the Batman. That is his term. So if Xi Jinping is the Bat Lady, he is the Batman. If in Duke Nuss had it's a huge school. It's a huge endowment. It's a huge lab. There's at least 20 or 30 people in that lab, and it's called Lympha's Lab. And everyone loves him, as do I. He's a great teacher. I learned from him. When I wanted to extract I'll say this about him. When I wanted to extract unpublished information from the United States CDC here in America, I referenced Lim-Fa Wang. I said, I have been reading the writing of Lim-Fa Wang for the past 2 years. I have come to the conclusion, Mr. CDC in America, that you are sitting on unpublished data and I would like to see it. And he more or less admitted it. He didn't let me see it, but he more or less admitted it. And he told me the results of it. So that's how important Lim-Fa is. I was able to extract unpublished data in America by referencing him. He's such a powerful teacher that he pulls you into the world. The problem with what I have is I have to basically turn you into a bat immunologist. And once I turned Dr. Razik into a bat immunologist, I was able for him to be able to explain it almost as good, if not better than I can. Once you turn into a bat immunologist like Lim-Fa Wang, you understand the origins of SARS-CoV-2. It's almost more important than reading Ralph Baric. It's almost more important than listening to Peter Daszak. It's almost more important than listening to Tony Fauci. I cannot emphasize this enough without going too far into the weeds about how important he is. He is the keystone. He is the cog. He was the driver. Everyone kind of spiders out from him. Peter Daszak was trained by him. Xi Jinping was trained by him. Ralph Baric went from a regular virologist to a bat virologist because of him. He has pulled the whole industry into the bat community. So that's essentially his importance. I cannot emphasize that enough. He is basically the first 15 chapters in my book. I have to kind of pull you into the world of bat virology and bat immunology.
And so your sense is that the budget and the ownership of this operation was most likely given, or I don't know whether you have any information or it's supputation, but was most likely coming from the US in terms of who was operating as well?
Yes, all of it, no doubt. I mean, that's what the U.S. does. We print money and spend it like drunken sailors. So Limfa has received a ton of U.S. money. He's basically a NIH contractor. He is a Tony Fauci contractor. He is all over. You remember that grant that was infamously canceled by the Wuhan Institute to the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Well, guess who got it? Limfa. All they did is just moved it from the Wuhan Institute of Virology to Limfa. He travels to Wuhan 3 or 4 times a year. So he's in Wuhan in November of 2019 to basically collect Danielle Anderson and get her out of the Wuhan BSL-4. It was Limpha Wong who vouched for Danielle Anderson to go into the Wuhan BSL-4. Limpha Wong sits on uh, the scientific board of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He is the one that got her in there. There's no PLA inside that BSL-4. The BSL-4 is the spacesuit that we basically see people walk into this positive pressure suit in this negative pressure room. That is the BSL-4 that Limpha's subordinate, his assistant professor, Danielle Anderson, is in. And she's in there from June until November of 2019. And she came out of that BSL-4 and she said, I was working on Ebola. Well, we all took it for, hook, line, and sinker until Murphy, Major Joseph Murphy, who I started off talking about, leaked DARPA Diffuse. And inside this top secret folder, inside this top secret Pentagon, program, it wasn't top secret, by the way. It was just moved into a top secret folder. It was an unclassified project that was later moved into a classified setting. He pulled it out of the classified folder, and inside this document is not just Ralph Barrick's name. It's not just Limpha Wong's name. In this document is Danielle Anderson's name. And I'm like, wow. The first name I saw was Ralph Barrick. The second name I saw was Limpha Wong. The third name I saw was Danielle Anderson. She is an Australian, and she is a white woman, and she is the only Westerner in Wuhan, more or less, scientist-wise, in 2019. And she said she was working on Ebola. And here she is on a top secret document working on coronaviruses with Ralph Barrick. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. She went quiet. She has not spoken to the media since she did that. And I've asked her, bless her heart, not her fault. Hey, look, I'm really not interested in you. I'm only interested in the guys over here in America. And she won't talk to me. Her colleagues kind of will. But once I got her boss, Limpha, to admit that he stepped down on January 10th, 2020, I'm like, you know what? She was zero. She is adamant, by the way. Danielle Anderson is adamant. She was not sick, and I completely believe her. She's a very healthy 40-year-old runner. But because she was a runner, she had an app called Strava. And because you have this app called Strava, your whereabouts are traced. And because her whereabouts are traced, we could trace her whereabouts because the U.S. military was spying, I guess, on the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And they pulled this cell phone report out and more or less published it in NBC News. And you can see it. And it's in the book. And it's pretty much out, public information now. But in there, you can see this cell phone that enters the Wuhan BSL-4 in June. It leaves in November. You see this other cell phone come from Singapore, and it goes into the Wuhan BSL-4. And it's the Duke Emerging Infectious Disease Division. It's obviously Limpha. So Limpha's cell phone has traveled from Singapore to Wuhan in November. Danielle Anderson's was in Wuhan from June until November. And they both left in November of 2019 and never really to come back and never really to have a story other than the fact that she was working on Ebola. No, I mean, it got out on her watch. Bless her heart, not her fault. This thing was so contagious. So contagious. You got Ralph Barrick and his fear and cleavage site. You got Vincent Munster and his aerosolized agent. This thing was so contagious. It was bound to get out. It was going to escape somehow. It could have been a BSL-5. It could have been a remote island. It could have been Neptune. It still would have found its way back because it was designed to spread. That was it. It was designed to do precisely what it did.
Okay, so before we go back to then what happened with this accident, it spills, and how everybody does what and where we are right now, and the role of Ralph Barrick or their lack of right now, because he seems to be, he seemed to have really avoided all kind of scrutiny at a very popular level. But I still want to unlock one more thing, which is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, if I'm not wrong, was built, or its security system was built by French nuclear sort of technology thing, and then Mérieux laboratory were either operating it. There is a thread that connects at some point Stéphane Bancel, the CEO of BioNTech, to the Wuhan Institute of Virology under the Mérieux umbrella. We know that story seems to be a kind of nod, and it's I struggle to connect it to the implication for what happened later on, and how all these countries went lock, stock, and barrel into the same sort of protocol, denying that this was either research or that they had anything to do with it. Or so, do you know anything about that bit of the story?
Yes, I was. That was one of the first things I bit into when I got into the lab leak debate. Biomuro is how I pronounce it. Was the one that I believe built the BSL-4. It comes to a dead end. Why? Because it's big money. That's what it is. There's a lot of money in there. Shizing Li, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, trained in Paris to work in the BSL-4. So there's a lot of money in that too. You take these international scientists, you bring them to your home base in Paris, you train them, and then they go back to the One Institute of Virology, and then they start lobbying for a BSL-4, and then Biomuro builds it. And I think Technip was the company I recognized in that it's over here in Houston in the oil and gas industry. I think they went in and did not certify it or were supposed to certify it. So don't worry, the French were heavily involved in it. And I don't think it's nefarious. I mean, you can come to your own conclusion. I just believe it's a good money grab. There's just a lot of money in those things. It's a beautiful looking building, that big giant BSL-4. I mean, it's got that French engineering, that French design, that French architecture, I guess, with a round shape to it, no corner, no edges. It's a masterpiece. And there were probably some issues there. Obviously, I think it has more to do with the fact that I've listened to Linfa Wong talk about a BSL-4. It requires 4 engineers full time just to replace the air filters on those things. It is a machine to keep those things going. You have a negative pressure room and a positive pressure suit. There's all kinds of things. Even in America, there's all kinds of holes that appear out of nowhere. There's all kinds of safety protocols that are short circuited. And these are first world countries with first world money. And I'm sure there's big issues going on in BSL-4s in France. You just don't see or hear about them because they don't publish the accidents unless And by the way, lab leaks happen all the time. I mean, once you dive into the details, there's probably one happening as we speak. I think there's one a day, and it's an animal bite. I cut my finger, I cut my spacesuit. It's simple stuff like that. But these things happen all the time. But technicians get infected all the time. What they're given is a mask, go home, and self isolate. Okay, you messed up. Now you're in timeout. So that's what happens. I mean, if Ebola infects you, you're dead. You're the only one that dies. I mean, who cares? I mean, you just suffered your own consequences. The problem with this thing, in my opinion, it wasn't lab leak. It was what leaked. What is that thing? Why is it so contagious? And give Linfa Wong and Daniel Anderson and all the other people credit that they went in. They did not use Xi Jinping's BSL-2, by the way. It's just I don't want to put money. I don't want to douse it, but I will do it this way without getting too far in the weeds. All you have to do is look at the back cover of the book, and she published this thing right here, RATG13 at the top. And Xi Jinping's BSL-2, when she published this thing at the top, she exposed this thing underneath it, and that's SARS-2 underneath it. And you do what's called the alignment. And when you do the alignment, this is what it is right there in the middle. It's called the fear and cleavage site, RRAR. And when Xi Jinping gave up this looks engineered. So my line to my fellow lab leakers is that if you believe the One Institute of Virology or anyone in China or any Chinese scientist inserted this and then published this, I don't think you're thinking straight. That is essentially the smoking gun for engineering right there. Look at that 100% amino acid match right there. It just keeps going and going. Oh, what's that? Right there in the middle is that fear and cleavage site, which Ralph Baric himself proposed to introduce. So that exonerates Xi Jinping's BSL-2. That exonerates pretty much all of China. I hate to talk like that, but that's kind of what's happened. They did invite these scientists from, I believe there were some French scientists there at one point. They did invite Daniel Anderson in. They did invite Linfa Wong in. They did invite Ralph Baric and his crazy research in. So they did that under the idea that BSL-4 was built to end this. I'll stop here. That BSL-4 was built under the idea of collaboration with the West. So yeah, is there some sort of idea that maybe we can copy the Western the technology? Yeah, in a way. But Ralph Baric made sure that no one could copy his technology. Not even his own American colleagues could copy his technology. It's pretty safe.
All right. Assuming there's an accident, therefore it's a leak, like, somebody gets, whether it's her or someone else in this lab gets contaminated. They go home. There is an event at one level, because we know this from several layers of data, that there is some sort of mini lockdown. They're struggling with some level of contagion. They close school. So from then on, what do you think happens? They agree to cover up. Each side does their own thing in terms of like, it's not me, it's you. It's not me, it's you. Is it a prisoner's dilemma game, which is if you speak, I speak? So what do you think is going on from that moment on?
All the above. Yeah, your question is my answer. It's all the above. So as far as the cover up goes, January 10th, Linfa Wong steps down. No one suspects it's engineered yet. January 24th of 2020, Xi Jinping of the Wuhan Institute of Virology publishes RATG13, which is already shown you. Now, someone named Christian Anderson, if you're in the lab league debate, you know who that is. He's basically a virologist out there in California, does what's called the alignment, what I just showed you on camera. And he says, oh, shit, it's engineered. And he's so confident it's engineered because he can do what we just did together. He's going to call the CIA and the FBI and notify them it's engineered. He has written an email to Tony Fauci saying, I'm going to do just that on January 31st of 2020. So February 1st, Fauci picks up the phone and calls him, and it says, you know what, I'll call the FBI, don't worry. And we'll do this teleconference tomorrow, February 1st of 2020. So there's a teleconference that involves many scientists on February 1st. Christian Drosten, the guys from Erasmus, Marion Koopmans, they all know who I am, by the way. They read what I write. Who else was on there? I'm trying to think of a Frenchman that may have been on there. I think everyone was on there except for a French scientist. But don't worry, there have been some French scientists involved in this
There's a
debate.
there's a guy from the University of Edinburgh that was in there.
Andrew Rambo, thank you. And these,
Yep.
these are three or four of them: Andrew Rambo, Christian Anderson, and Eddie Holmes from Australia. Are the what's called evolutionary virologists. They are world class evolutionary virologists, and they just did what we did, what's called the alignment, and they can now see the SARS-2 is engineered because Xizing Li of the One Institute of Virology, a Chinese scientist, has provided a piece of evidence showing that it's engineered. She basically is put up a piece of evidence that says, hey, look, it's engineered, but I didn't engineer it. And that's what's made everyone so confused until now, at least in my opinion. So on February 1st, they, meaning Christian Anderson, presents the evidence and shows that slide with that alignment that I just showed you and says, look, it's engineered. And everyone else is kind of like, wow, maybe it is, and there you can kind of see them going through their own conspiracy, which is what happens when you first are introduced to this thing. But quietly listening in the background was an unannounced participant named Ralph Barrick. Christian Anderson did not invite him, nor did Jeremy Farrar, nor did anyone else, Andrew Rambo or Eddie Holmes. They made sure they didn't want him on the phone because they knew he collaborated with the One Institute of Virology. He was pretty infamous for collaborating with them in that 2015 paper we talked about earlier, which even made the news. So he's got a collaboration going on with them. So, hey, well, it's not involved Ralph. He's going to be, kind of a, conflict of interest. But it turns out he was secretly listening. And it turns out Tony Fauci secretly invited Ralph Barrick to listen to that February 1st call. So every virologist on the planet is going to lean towards engineering, going to lead towards a lab leak until Ralph Barrick involves himself. And 2 days later, on February 3rd, during a follow-up meeting in front of the CIA, in front of the FBI, in front of all the other intel agencies here in America, Ralph Barrick verbally attacked Christian Anderson, ambushed him, steamrolled him was the last term I used. And he basically gaslit him out of that idea. So Ralph Barrick not only created this thing, he helped cover up this thing. And when you're a world-class 40-year coronavirologist, you basically are going to cause any younger guy like Christian Anderson to kowtow. And Christian Anderson kowtowed. He basically, I give up. No mercy. It's basically it's an argument he wasn't willing to get into because the alpha Ralph has emerged in Ralph Barrick, and he has basically attacked Christian Anderson. So that's what happened. So they were going to lean towards engineering. I don't know if they would have ever admitted it with or without Ralph. I'm kind of thinking they may have been a little more open about it, but Ralph Barrick involved himself in an unknowing kind of a dirty way. So to answer your question, when this is February 2020. I mean, it has not left Wuhan yet. I mean, if you cover it up, who cares? I mean, it'll burn out just like SARS-1 did. We'll all move on with our lives in a few months, and we'll never talk about that lab leak ever again. But it was just designed to go. It was designed to be contagious. So they almost like underestimated how good they were at what they created. So I think the cover up is basically just it's an unintended consequence. They just kind of steamrolled itself into something even bigger.
And so, what are we to make then of? Okay, so number one, they then play the whole card that this is natural origin. They publish stuff. They go on into a massive media campaign around the world to say this is zoonotic, zoonotic, zoonotic. Then there's the WHO cover with that. Who is playing that card? That if we go, this is zoonotic. Then it quickly pivots to what are we going to do about it? And then you're entering the vaccine sort of gamut, which is, overlapping two different presidency. So what do you think happens there? Rather than just cut your losses and just, as you said, if they knew it was going to burn itself out anyway, just go, oh yeah, it's a coronavirus, maybe it's novel, but it's not that bad. Do this, do that, treat people when they become sick. Why do they go this whole out kind of immense gas machine saying, and then it became almost bigger than them. And then the countermeasure, the vaccine, then becomes something so enormous. And then you have to have the mandate on top of that. So what do you think created that? Was that a willful decision to make sure the origin story never comes out? Or is it just kind of like, again, a money grab? Hey, opportunity, let's just money grab.
The latter of the two. Yeah. I mean, never let a crisis go to waste. That is the American political slogan here sometimes. So, you have a pandemic, people are scared. It motivates people to buy stuff, do crazy stuff. I mean, this people were just completely irrational. And not just like the powers that be, the people underneath them too, the lockdown warriors, the vaccine warriors. That's why I think it's so funny if we can just have an adult conversation about what they created, a vaccine, an animal vaccine, that we can really have a serious conversation about what the heck they did and who's they. I hate to use the word they. These governments though are if they're given the opportunity to tell people what to do, they will gladly take it, and so they will lock you down. They will force a vaccine mandate upon you, and people, that vaccine. I don't know how popular it was in France, but it was popular here. I mean, it was like a 90% uptake rate. It was, and I think if there's a lesson here, if your listeners weren't into it, I usually try to avoid the vaccine debate per se, like the mRNA vaccine, but there's a lot of overlap between the two. The same guy, Ralph Berry, that created SARS-CoV-2, is heavily involved in the mRNA, the Moderna one to be precise. I mean, he's so heavily involved, it's even hard for me to get my brain around it. I'm basically a Ralph Berry historian at this point, and I'm having a really hard time, deciphering this, but he's working with the team that created the Moderna mRNA in 2016, 17, and 18.
Yeah.
So if you want to see, so there's two ill side effects to SARS-CoV-2 and the mRNA, and I get into this in the back of one of my chapters, and it's inflammation of the body. So both the virus and the vaccine, as most people see it, SARS-2 and the mRNA have the same ill side effects, and it's basically inflammation, and a lot of that is Ralph Berrick's spike protein causing that. So essentially, it drives this inflammation of the body. And that kind of what comes back to what Linfa Wong was always teaching about bats. They have an immune system that can basically harbor a virus because it doesn't attack itself. The problem with SARS-CoV-2 is that your immune system starts to attack itself. And you see a lot of these things happen. And once you start to study, Linfa Wong and bat immunology and Ralph Berrick and what he was doing with Moderna, you can start to see a lot of overlap between what happened. So, I mean, I don't make it sound like some grand conspiracy. Only about 5 or 6 people created SARS-CoV-2. And even if those 5 or 6 people said we did it, I don't think anyone believed them except for the people that read my book. So I think it's just let's just take advantage of what's going on here. And there was a lot of money to be made for a lot of people in this. So there's no denying that. And a lot of people were scared and they were going to buy the product.
So to go back to where we started with the Ralph Barrick issue. So in your mind, explain how he has managed to evade scrutiny, both legal, scientific, political. Is he bigger than Fauci in some ways, or is it kind of again it's a prisoners pact between the two of them because they go back a long time and they probably go back to other stuff that they're doing. So, what is this relationship between Barrick and Fauci, and what's the role of Barrick right now, and what can we expect in the future, considering where we are right now in 2026?
So I I've I'm having a hard time answering it too. It's a bit of weird, but Ralph Berrick pre-confessed to the crime of creating COVID-19. He wrote this document in 2018. You would think he'd be the primary suspect, and someone would basically ask him for an alibi, and no one has. But Jeffrey Sachs and I have approached him in the past, I don't know, January of this year. So we're in 2026, and Sachs wrote the email. I just sent it, and it'd be very professional, as am I not. But when professors talk to one another, they can be very professional and cordial, and they can extract an answer from one another. And more or less, Jeffrey Sachs says, "Give us an alibi, please, or we're going to publish this story about you in Brownstone." It turned out to be, and in there, we basically said, "You did it, unless you want to give us an alibi." He forwarded the email to UNC Communications Department. Okay. They forwarded my email written by more or less Jeffrey Sachs. They said, here, we're going to forward to UNC Communications. UNC Communications Department came back to me and said, our only statement to you is our testimony. Ralph Berrick has given a closed door testimony, but there is a transcript. Give the U.S. government credit. They did question him. They did publish the transcript of that thing. And inside the 6-hour testimony in 2024, Ralph Berrick could not provide an alibi. In fact, he further incriminated himself. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but his only alibi was his greatest confession. He reconstructed the genome in 2020 to try and cover his tracks. He chopped up the genome from 6 pieces to 7. So to make it real, that's a good little segue there. How do I know Ralph Berrick did it? There are what's called 5 restriction sites in the genome that create 6 segments. And Ralph Berrick, in testimony, said, my Technology is safer because I use 6 segments and I pre-assemble these in a BSL2. And then I do final assembly in BSL3. That's precisely what we see in SARS-CoV-2. 5 restriction sites, 6 segments. And the US government, give the US government some credit here, asked Ralph Barrick, hey, in early 2020, are there any restriction sites? These are the scissors and the glue that people like Ralph Barrick used to construct a genome. Are there any restriction sites inside this genome that suggest it's engineered? And the guy, the US biodefense official, was saying, maybe it's some guy in North Korea, over there by the North Korean border. Do we know what they're up to? He's basically talking like I was early in the lab leak debate. And Ralph Barrick responds back, though, to this early 2020 pandemic email to US government biodefense officials. Absolutely no evidence of genetic engineering. He did not mention the fear and cleavage site. He did not mention the 5 restriction sites, creating the 6 segments that he uses. His own technology uses that precise recipe to make these things. And he did not mention any of that in early 2020. So Ralph Barrick is lying to the U.S. government, lying to the CIA, lying to the FBI. He's even manipulating the FBI agent that's basically been assigned to protect him from death threats. So the whole thing is just utterly bizarre. Don't get me wrong. I am now the first person to go on camera, along with Jeffrey Sachs, and openly accuse Ralph Barrick of doing this. So I think that's how he got away with it for so long. The lab leakers blame Xi Li, blame the PLA, blame the CIA, blame the CCP. They're all innocent. I hate to say this. The CCP is innocent and the CIA is innocent. And more or less, I hate to say this, but the U.S. government did their job, and they asked him early in the pandemic, is it engineered? And he was the only one that could tell them. And he said, no, because he engineered it. So how did he get away with it? The guy, the expert that the U.S. government turned to ask if it's engineered was the one who engineered it. This was the prisoner's dilemma, I guess. And it took some nobody like me, along with a bunch of lab leakers that did the work. I just took what they did and put the evidence in front of Ralph. So people that published that restriction site paper, is a German scientist, a Netherlands scientist, an American scientist. They did it to try and crucify Xi Li. And I said, no, there's 6 segments in there. That's the way Ralph Barrick does it. And so that, I took their evidence and repurposed it, essentially, their hard research. So that was the problem we're having. No one has openly accused Ralph of doing this. No one could identify him. In order to go on camera and talk about this, you're basically going up against, a team of lawyers. UNC has a $5 billion endowment. By the way, Duke Nuss is like twice that. It's like 10 million. It's got a ton of money. All these universities have tons of money, tons of lawyers, and they will slander you. So I cannot get the U.S. media to talk about this because they use the word defamation. Not even Jeffrey Sachs could get our letter published in some sort of semi-mainstream left-wing news outlet because the guy was afraid of defamation. I don't really blame him. Unless you're like 100% confident Ralph Barrick did it, you're kind of taking a risk because they can come after you. This is not defamation, by the way, what I'm doing, because it was an animal vaccine. It was an accident. Now, and he defamed himself in the university by the way he acted post-pandemic, attacking Christian Anderson, lying to the CIA, manipulating the FBI agent that was assigned to him. My last Substack, Reverse Engineering the Origins of SARS-CoV-2, has 40 questions, and they're basically rhetorical. They show you that he did it in a way. And he will not defend himself because he can't, because, he did it. It's his, what leaked from that Wuhan lab was Ralph Barrick's Pietà, his masterpiece. He was the Michelangelo of SARS-CoV-2 of coronaviruses. He created such a masterpiece. It was designed to look as if it came from nature. This is really going to freak some people out. He's not so much trying to hide the engineering scars. He has what's called a no-seum technique, where he can hide the engineering scars in a virus so it doesn't look like man has manipulated it. But he's not trying to hide it from us lab leakers. He was trying to hide it from the lab animal that he's trying to infect, in this case, Chinese bats. So if the bat sees the virus as a natural sequence from nature, he will accept it and create antibodies against it. Once you dive into the details of virology, you start to see the engineering almost goes from icky, and don't get me wrong, it's icky, to beautiful. If you can create a genome from scratch that nature had never seen before, you could use that. It's a powerful tool to be used as a vaccine, an animal vaccine, and the animal will accept the virus as is, as from nature, and it will create antibodies against it. And that was the idea he was doing. And he created something so novel, so new. It took us lab leakers so long to figure it all out. But give the U.S. government credit. We have what's called FOIA here, Freedom of Information Act. And they went in there and they, one gal named Emily Kopp from the U.S. Right to Know, went in there and did a FOIA on USGS. That is the United States Geological Survey. They look after the bat caves in America. Like, what does that have anything to do with this? Well, Ralph Barrick will not give up his records. So she went to the USGS to get his emails on this DARPA diffused document. And inside those documents, you can see Ralph Barrick has patented and created SARS-CoV-2 in 2018. He has created something about 25% different on the spike protein from SARS-1. Guess what SARS-2 is? 24.7. So that's he has SARS-2 in his lab in 2018. That's how crazy this whole thing was. That we just couldn't. It wasn't in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's not to be found in nature. It's to be found on the campus of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. at the University of North Carolina. And how did he get away with it? Well, no one really could even get their brain around that until now. So it took us lab leakers a while to get us going. And us lab leakers means myself and Jeffrey Sachs. I get into fights with fellow lab leakers about this because it's sunk cost. They've spent so much time going after the CIA, CCP, PLA, and whatnot. And I'm like, no, guys, you're all wrong. I mean, I'm sorry to do this, but this is where the evidence has led to a white man in a white lab coat. And it's just not uncomfortable.
And what about Fauci? What and when did he know?
Great question. I'm not sure. In my book, I basically give the impression that he knows by January 10th. Limpa Wong has stepped down. I think that's news inside the NIH industry, and it's news in the science industry. Tony Fauci is having teleconferences with Rocky Mountain Lab by January 12th. Tony Fauci receives a presentation from the guy that aerosolized Ralph Barrick's agent named Vincent Munster on January 27th. I believe Ralph Barrick is in communication. I don't have proof of that. I don't have an email. I don't have a conversation with him because Ralph Barrick is brought in secretly into the February 1st teleconference. So sometime in early January, Fauci is aware that, oh, shit, this thing is a bat vaccine. And Tony Fauci himself has been working on contagious animal vaccines since 2012. He is deeply involved in this kind of risky research. Again, he always called Mother Nature is the worst bioterrorist of them all. That was his saying. That's the way he believed. He did not think some sort of Al Qaeda agent from Iraq was the problem. But don't get me wrong, he would travel to Iraq, during the Iraq War, because that's how heavily involved he is in this biodefense industry. The anthrax stuff involved him. All the Ebola outbreaks involved him. All these other little outbreaks around the world involved him. But he's starting to see over the 20 years and post 9/11 that it's not really a terrorist we have to worry about. It's the animal. And so he was heavily involved in this idea of vaccinating animals. So what did Tony Fauci know and when? I'm not quite sure. He does know he's involved. He does know that he needs to involve someone like Ralph Barrick to quiet this thing. And he did shovel about $60 million to Ralph Barrick before retiring in 2022. For Ralph Barrick's pet project, probably to keep him quiet, which is probably going to work, by the way, in the grand scheme of things. I don't know. And I think Ralph Barrick is basically giving up some stuff. Like I was invited to the February 1st teleconference. I think the idea is that if I go, Tony Fauci is going to go with me. So don't worry. They're all attached to the hip. Fauci has funded Ralph Barrick's research. Fauci has covered up what happened in Wuhan because it involved U.S. labs and his own lab, Rocky Mountain Lab, the University of North Carolina. So Fauci knows. Fauci knows who I am. He may even watch this for all I know. I have made it. I'm not trying to be pugnacious about this. Dr. Fauci, you provide me an alibi and I will quit talking about you like this. Otherwise, I'm going to soil your great reputation. And I'll be honest, when I went into my book, I did not like him. When I came out of my book and finished it, I did not like him. I mean, the power of this little 5'6" guy to cover this thing up and to not just create it, to cover it up. It's just incredible to me. And he always got away with it. The guy that everyone turned to, I'm sure even the French turned to Fauci in some form or fashion, for advice in the pandemic. Do we wear a mask? Do we lock down? Do we take the vaccine? Oh, yes, of course. Was the guy that created the pandemic. He didn't fund it. He created it. The lab leak narrative is that Tony Fauci took some of your tax dollars and tossed it to the Pacific Ocean and some Chinaman messed up. And I'm like, no. Tony Fauci created this thing and he sipped off to Wuhan for testing. The idea was, I guess, benevolent to stop the next SARS-like spillover event.
So to finish here, I have another question, but it's really just curious at this stage. What do you think the CDC and all the NIH guys, like the head of the CDC, Volensky, the before her, the guy that is now testifying in Congress, that he thought after a while, not at the beginning, but eventually he thought this was engineered. I mean, how much do you think they knew and they tagged along, or they were just mouthpiece and they repeated, right? You know,
Latter of the two mouthpieces, go along to get along. You really can't rock the boat on this thing or you're out of your job. I think you're talking about Robert Redfield.
yeah,
He is the former CDC director, and he's come out in favor of lab leak.
correct.
Him and I are very close, by the way. Not close, like I've never communicated with him, but close in theories. I say it's a self-spreading animal vaccine. He thinks it's a self-spreading human vaccine. So
Yeah,
I've tried to get to
yeah,
him and basically explain to him, look, it wasn't designed to spread in humans. It was designed to spread in bats. And to come back to that, bats are not birds, they're mammals. So if you design something to spread in a bat, it can spread in a human. Similar H2 receptor.
yeah.
Bats have mammalian cells, so they also have furin inside their cells. Barrick inserted the furin cleavage site not to infect humans, to infect bats. I want to make that very clear. He did not set out to blow up the world. He was set out to infect bats, and it turns out there was a spillover event in the one in serology. So what do they know? They know less than you and I know. I can guarantee you that. I have the few that I've interacted with, they also put on blinders. Whenever I start to overwhelm them with evidence, they'll go crazy on me and basically end the conversation. But it's kind of a weird little thing that that's what I'm here to tell you. A scientist isn't going to go on camera and tell you what happened. So they're too in the weeds. They can't even they're colleagues with Fauci. Even if someone like Robert Redfield still respects Fauci. That's the problem we're having essentially. And they think Fauci's innocent. They think Ralph Barrick's innocent. The U.S. government still thinks Ralph Barrick's innocent. That's to answer that question. They think they're innocent. It's that jingoistic effect. One of our own would never lie to us, would they? They would not create this thing. Something bad happened, therefore someone bad did it. So I don't get too far in the weeds on that, essentially. But it's unfortunate. But yes, international media is more interested in what I have to say than local media. International, I think governments will be more interested in what I have to say. The World Health Organization has engaged me. The World Health Organization, give them credit, engaged me, and they responded to me in nature. So give them credit. I do believe that if this thing's going to be ended, solved, it'll be an international thing, and that's the kind of where Jeff Sachs has kind of pushed this thing. The U.S. government, the U.S. media, they are worthless. They will not talk to me. I mean, Alex Berenson is the only one that talked to me. He's probably the biggest name that would. Everyone else knows of me. They won't touch me though. I mean, I guess they see it as career suicide. I don't know. I mean, in my rant, as long as we have the truth on our side, I have nothing to fear. I mean, that's the point of this whole thing. Just have the truth, and you can go on camera and talk about it, and not worry and suffer the repercussions. It's just don't worry about it. Don't worry about where this goes.
Well, that's a big sentence to finish this informative exchange on. So, Jim, I will ask you this same question I ask all my guests on this podcast, which is to be able to do all you've done and all you want to do going forward. What is your weird sauce for life?
It's just that seek the truth, and let the chips fall where they may. Be a truth seeker. I think that's the best thing in life. Try to follow suit smarter than what you woke up from, and be curious about things, which is what I was. I was just curious about this whole thing. And you may find yourself in a dark alley alone with no one else to follow. And but as long as you follow your intuition and your curiosity, it can lead to places like this. I think it's one of the greatest stories of our lifetime, and it's so counterintuitive and hard to digest that it takes a little while. It usually takes people about a year, to be honest with you, after they introduce themselves to my theory or this thought or whatever you want to call it. About a year later, they come back and they go, that answers a lot of questions, doesn't it? To cover up the chaos and all that. So seek the truth. That's my advice for life.
Weird. Sounds great. And where can our audience find you? Remind them the title of the book, where they can get the book, and when they can find you otherwise on social media.
So on media, COVID-19 mystery solved. It leaked from the Wuhan lab, but it's not Chinese junk. And there's the BSL-4 right there. I could have showed you, built by the French. There's that beautiful device, that beautiful building. I really do think it's interesting. Essentially that's what I was talking about, that pressure room right there. This is the RATG13 genome on the top, SARS-2 on the bottom. You flip it over to the book, and you can see Tony Fauci's lab right here, essentially. So you don't have to buy the book, but you just have to look at the back cover and you can see the thing's engineered. That's on Amazon. A lot of people, though, like my Substack, Reverse Engineering the Origins of SARS-CoV-2. It's every week. It's free. It's just me, on basically a weekly news roundup. And the last one I did, I guess last night, it was on Sunday, was 40 questions for Ralph Barrick. And the last thing is my most infamous thing is my Twitter account, JS5. I'm a bit, vile on there sometimes, but that's where I test my ideas. So that was, a lot of people see me as being a troll or someone mean online. No, I needed to fact check this before I go public. And the only way to fact check this was to get into an argument with fellow lab leakers, and that was done on Twitter. So those are the 3 devices to find me.
Great. Thank you very much for the time that you took and your openness to answer questions that may or may not be so smart, but tried my best to connect some of the dots that, connects us all, because in the end, it's not just an American story, really. It's a world story. So thank you again for your time. And I wish you all the success with the book and with your Substack, and of course, with the biggest success of all, in finding the truth. Thank you very much for your time.
Shit.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest, and stay curious about life.